Edinburgh in the early 1700s was not a city designed for comfort, efficiency, or personal happiness. It was designed mostly by accident, gravity, and the firm belief that whatever landed in the street was no longer anyone's problem. If you lived here, survival was less about bravery and more about tolerance. Tolerance for smells, crowds, noise, cold, and the unsettling awareness that something wet might fall on you at any moment. The city was tightly packed within medieval walls, which meant people did not spread outward. They stacked upward instead. Tall stone tenements rose 6, 7, sometimes 10 stories high, creating narrow closes where sunlight visited briefly and then gave up. These buildings held everyone at once: merchants, laborers, professionals, beggars, children, animals, and whatever illnesses happened to be circulating that month. Privacy was not a concept so much as a rumor. If you woke up in 1700s Edinburgh, it was likely cold. Stone holds cold well, and fireplaces were expensive to feed. You slept in layers of clothing, not for style, but for survival. The air inside was stale, smoky, and damp, and the floor was rarely dry. Many rooms housed entire families in a single space, sometimes with lodgers, because rent inside the city walls was high and space was scarce. Comfort was not expected. Endurance was. The streets below were worse. There was no modern sewage system, which meant waste was handled in the most direct way possible. People dumped it out of windows. This was not done randomly, at least not always. Tradition required a warning shout before disposal, but accuracy varied, and so did volume. If you were walking below, you learned to move quickly, listen carefully, and accept that luck played a role. Water sources were communal, often contaminated, and heavily used. Wells and pumps served thousands, and cleanliness was aspirational at best. Bathing was rare, partly because heating water took time and fuel, and partly because people believed too much bathing weakened the body. Smell, therefore, was not a sign of neglect. It was simply how the city functioned. Disease thrived in this environment. Plague outbreaks were less frequent by the 1700s, but typhus, smallpox, and dysentery remained common. Medical understanding was limited, and treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or substances that made the situation worse. Survival depended less on medicine and more on avoiding people, which was difficult in a city where everyone lived on top of each other. Work began early and ended when light or energy ran out. Trades were physical, repetitive, and rarely safe. Accidents were common, and injury could mean unemployment. There was no safety net. If you could not work, you relied on family, charity, or the slow process of becoming invisible. Children worked as soon as they were useful, which was earlier than modern sensibilities would prefer. Food was filling but uninspiring. Oats dominated most meals, usually in the form of porridge or bread. Meat was expensive and often preserved rather than fresh. Vegetables were seasonal, and spices were limited unless you were wealthy. Hunger was not constant for everyone, but variety certainly was not guaranteed. Eating was practical, not pleasurable. At night, the city did not grow quiet so much as it shifted tone. Taverns emptied, arguments moved into the streets, and the dark hid both people and hazards. There was little lighting beyond candles and oil lamps, so walking after sunset required familiarity with the terrain and a willingness to accept minor injuries. Crime existed, but so did community. Neighbors knew each other's business whether they wanted to or not. To survive living in 1700s Edinburgh, you needed resilience, modest expectations, and a strong sense of balance, both physical and emotional. You learned to endure cold, noise, and inconvenience as normal. You accepted that daily life was uncomfortable and occasionally hazardous. And if you managed to live a full life there, it was not because the city made it easy, but because humans are remarkably good at adapting to places that give them very little choice. If you're still awake, don't worry. The city would have worn you down eventually. Living another day in 1700s Edinburgh meant learning how to move through the city without drawing too much attention, because attention usually came with inconvenience. Noise was constant, but silence was suspicious. If things were quiet, something had likely gone wrong, or was about to. The city functioned on routine disruption, and residents adapted by lowering their expectations even further. Clothing was practical, heavy, and rarely dry. Wool dominated wardrobes because it retained warmth even when damp, which was most of the time. Linen shirts absorbed sweat and street moisture equally well, and shoes were sturdy but unforgiving. Mud was unavoidable. Streets were uneven, poorly maintained, and shared with animals. Horses, cows, pigs, and the occasional goat moved freely, contributing not only to congestion but also to the general texture of the ground. You watched where you stepped, but success was not guaranteed. Laundry was a labor-intensive process that rarely achieved the results one might hope for. Washing required hauling water, heating it, scrubbing fabric by hand, and then finding a place to dry it in a city with limited sunlight and abundant smoke. Clothes were worn repeatedly between washes, not out of neglect, but necessity. Smell was managed, not eliminated. Perfumes existed, but they were expensive and often overwhelmed rather than improved the situation. Social life happened largely out of necessity. Taverns served as gathering places because they were warm, relatively bright, and provided alcohol that made the environment easier to tolerate. Beer and ale were safer than water, which meant people drank throughout the day without considering it indulgent. Drunkenness was common, but so was moderation. Alcohol was a tool, not a luxury, and it helped blur the sharper edges of daily discomfort. Religion played a quiet but persistent role in shaping behavior. The church exerted moral pressure, enforced discipline, and reminded people that suffering had meaning, or at least an explanation. Public punishment was not unusual, and shame was used as a corrective tool. You learned quickly which behaviors attracted disapproval and which were quietly ignored. Survival included not only staying alive, but staying out of trouble. Housing conditions did not improve as you climbed the social ladder, at least not dramatically. Wealthier residents lived higher up in the same tenements, where air was marginally better and smells slightly delayed. Climbing stairs was a daily exercise in endurance. Carrying goods, water, or firewood up multiple flights was part of normal life. If you lived at the top, you were rewarded with distance from street filth and punished with effort. Fire was a constant risk. Buildings were crowded, fireplaces burned regularly, and materials were flammable. A single mistake could spread quickly through a close. Buckets of water and communal effort were the primary defenses. When fires happened, they were devastating, not because people lacked concern, but because there were few effective tools to stop them. Education existed, but it was unevenly distributed. Edinburgh had a reputation for learning, particularly among men who could afford schooling. For others, education came through observation and repetition. Skills were passed down through apprenticeships and family tradition. You learned by doing, often incorrectly at first, and hoped mistakes were not fatal. Weather dictated mood as much as calendar dates. Winters were long, dark, and biting. Summers were brief and often wet. Seasonal affect was not named, but it was experienced. People endured by focusing on routine and community. There was comfort in familiarity, even when familiarity was unpleasant. Death was visible and frequent enough to be unremarkable. Funerals passed through the streets, illness moved from household to household, and life expectancy was uncertain. This did not make people careless, but it did make them pragmatic. You planned less for the distant future and more for the coming week. Long-term ambition was a luxury reserved for those with resources and luck. To continue surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you adjusted your sense of normal. You learned that discomfort was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed. You accepted the city as it was, not because it was good, but because it was home. And slowly, almost without noticing, you adapted well enough to keep going. By the time you had settled into the rhythm of 1700s Edinburgh, the city no longer shocked you. That did not mean it improved. It simply meant your standards had lowered enough to meet reality halfway. Survival was not dramatic. It was repetitive, slightly damp, and quietly exhausting. Morning routines depended on occupation, but they all began with negotiation. Negotiation with the cold, with stiff joints, and with the question of whether today's effort would be worth the energy it required. Beds were simple and rarely comfortable. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers, neither of which aged gracefully. Sleep was light, interrupted by noise from neighbors, street activity below, or the slow drip of water through stone walls that never fully dried. Heating a room took planning. Firewood or coal had to be purchased, carried, and rationed. Most people used less heat than they wanted, and more clothing than felt reasonable. Breath was visible indoors during winter, and fingers went numb during simple tasks. You learned to work slowly, because speed wasted energy, and energy was valuable. Daily movement through the city required awareness. Closes were narrow, twisting, and poorly drained. After rain, which was frequent, they became channels of runoff carrying whatever had been left behind overnight. Shoes absorbed moisture and smells equally well. Dry footwear was a temporary condition at best. Falls were common, and injuries were treated with patience rather than urgency. If you could still walk, you continued. Markets provided structure to the week. Goods arrived irregularly, and availability changed with weather and transport. Fresh food was unpredictable, and prices fluctuated without warning. Bargaining was common, but desperation weakened one's position. Those with steady income fared better, though no one was entirely secure. A single illness or injury could undo years of stability. Women's labor was constant and undervalued. In addition to domestic work, many contributed economically through washing, sewing, brewing, or selling goods. These tasks were physically demanding and rarely acknowledged. Pregnancy and childbirth carried real risk, and maternal mortality was an accepted reality. Survival often depended on other women, neighbors who stepped in because no official system existed to help. Children learned quickly that usefulness mattered. They fetched water, ran errands, assisted in trades, and absorbed skills through proximity. Childhood was short, not because people lacked affection, but because labor was necessary. Education for most children ended when their contribution became more valuable than their lessons. Knowledge was practical, focused on what kept a household functioning. Public spaces were crowded and loud, but also essential. News traveled by conversation, not print. Gossip carried warnings as often as entertainment. Knowing which close to avoid, which neighbor was ill, or which employer was unreliable could mean the difference between inconvenience and disaster. Information was survival currency. Law enforcement existed, but it was inconsistent. Justice moved slowly and unevenly. Minor disputes were often handled informally, while serious crimes could linger unresolved. Punishments were public, meant to deter through visibility rather than fairness. Watching was part of life, whether you wanted to or not. It reinforced boundaries and reminded everyone of their position. Despite everything, people formed attachments to the city. Familiar routes, regular faces, and shared hardship created a sense of belonging. Humor survived in dry, understated forms. Complaints were common, but leaving was difficult. Moving required money, opportunity, and the willingness to exchange known discomfort for unknown risk. As years passed, you measured time differently, not by milestones, but by seasons endured. Winters survived were achievements, illnesses avoided were victories, longevity was quiet success. Few people expected comfort and fewer still demanded it. Life was something to be managed, not optimized. To continue surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you relied less on hope and more on habit. You woke, worked, ate, and rested in cycles that rarely changed. You learned to accept what could not be fixed and to conserve energy for what could. And while the city never became kind, it became familiar enough to tolerate, which in its own understated way was enough to keep going. After enough time surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh became less about reacting and more about anticipating. You learned what would go wrong before it happened, which was useful because it usually did happen. Preparation was modest, but it mattered. A spare candle, an extra loaf, a neighbor who owed you a favor. These were not luxuries. They were buffers against inconvenience turning into disaster. Sound shaped the city as much as stone. Bells marked time, church hours, market openings, funerals, and emergencies. Vendors shouted their goods in familiar rhythms. Arguments echoed up the close, sometimes resolving themselves, sometimes not. At night, footsteps carried farther, and voices sounded closer than they were. Sleep adjusted around noise rather than expecting silence. People learned to rest in fragments. Cleanliness remained a relative concept. Houses were swept, not washed. Floors were scraped and covered with rushes or cloth to absorb moisture. Vermin were common but accepted as part of indoor life. Cats were valued less for affection and more for efficiency. Fleas, lice, and other companions were persistent, and scratching was an unconscious habit. Comfort did not include being entirely unbitten. Money moved slowly through the city and rarely stayed long. Wages were modest, expenses constant. Rent, fuel, food, and repairs consumed most income. Saving was difficult, though not impossible. Those who managed it did so quietly, knowing that visible wealth attracted attention. Debt was common, and repayment schedules were flexible in theory and stressful in practice. Illness disrupted routines without warning. A cough could linger for months. Fevers arrived suddenly and departed unpredictably. Care was provided at home, usually by family or neighbors. Physicians were consulted selectively, partly due to cost and partly due to uncertainty about whether their involvement would help. Recovery was slow, and returning to work too early was common because alternatives were limited. Public health measures were minimal but not entirely absent. During outbreaks, authorities attempted quarantines, which were unevenly enforced. Houses could be marked, movement restricted, and fear intensified. These measures slowed commerce and deepened hardship, but they were accepted as necessary interruptions. Survival meant compliance, even when it was inconvenient or frightening. Entertainment existed, though it was rarely elaborate. Music drifted from taverns, storytelling filled evenings, and occasional festivals broke the routine. These moments were valued not for spectacle, but for contrast. They reminded people that time passed, even when days felt repetitive. Laughter was brief but genuine, often directed at shared misfortune rather than triumph. The social order was visible and rarely challenged. Class differences shaped opportunities, expectations, and interactions. Deference was learned early. Speaking out of place had consequences. Advancement was possible but slow and often dependent on patronage rather than merit. For most, stability mattered more than ambition. Staying afloat was success enough. Travel outside the city was limited for many residents. Roads were rough, transport expensive, and reasons to leave were practical rather than recreational. When people did travel, they returned with news, goods, and comparisons that rarely made local life seem better. Still, familiarity won. The known discomfort of home outweighed the uncertainty elsewhere. Time blurred together in a city where change was gradual. Buildings aged, people rotated in and out, but routines persisted. You noticed small shifts, a new shop, a repaired stair, a neighbor gone without explanation. These were markers of progress and loss, neither celebrated nor ignored. They were noted, then folded into daily life. As you continued surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you stopped imagining improvement as something dramatic. Better meant warmer, drier, quieter. It meant fewer interruptions, not greater pleasures. You aimed for continuity, to wake up tomorrow and repeat what worked today. And if that sounds unambitious, it was also realistic. The city rewarded those who endured, not those who expected it to change. Survival was not heroic. It was steady, restrained, and often dull, which, under the circumstances, was exactly what made it possible. As weeks became months and months blurred into years, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh meant developing a quiet awareness of limits. You learned what your body could tolerate and where it would begin to fail. Pushing too hard rarely led to reward. It usually led to illness, injury, or a stretch of days where getting out of bed felt optional but was not. Food routines settled into predictability. Breakfast was simple or skipped. Midday meals depended on work schedules, often eaten standing or while walking. Supper was the most reliable moment of pause, though it was still modest. Warm food mattered more than flavor. A hot bowl of oats or broth did not inspire joy, but it restored enough strength to continue. Hunger sharpened patience, not creativity. Alcohol remained a steady presence, but excess had consequences that were quickly felt. A hangover in a cold, damp room was less tolerable than moderation. People learned their limits early, often through experience rather than advice. Drinking was social and practical, but responsibility was enforced by circumstance. If you failed to function the next day, no one compensated for your absence. Work relationships shaped daily stability. Apprenticeships tied young workers to masters for years, offering training in exchange for labor and obedience. Conditions varied widely. Some arrangements were fair, others harsh. Complaints were rarely productive. Endurance was the expected response. Changing positions required connections or timing, neither of which could be relied upon. Women navigated a narrower range of options, but within those limits, they exercised agency quietly. Managing households required organization, negotiation, and resilience. Decisions about food, spending, and childcare were constant and consequential. Mistakes were felt immediately. Success went unnoticed because it simply looked like things continuing as they should. Public spaces carried their own etiquette. You learned where to stand, how long to linger, and when to move on. Blocking a passage or delaying others invited frustration. The city rewarded efficiency, not contemplation. Even pauses were strategic. You rested when conditions allowed, not when you felt tired. Smells remained a constant backdrop. You stopped identifying them individually and accepted them as atmosphere. Smoke, waste, damp stone, unwashed bodies, and food remnants blended into something familiar. It was unpleasant, but predictable. Sudden changes in smell were more concerning, often signaling fire, illness, or spoiled supplies. Timekeeping was imprecise. Clocks existed, but they were not universal. Bells and daylight guided schedules more than exact hours. This looseness reduced urgency but increased uncertainty. Appointments were approximate. Delays were expected. Patience was not praised, but it was necessary. Conflict was unavoidable in close quarters. Arguments between neighbors erupted and resolved with equal speed. Some lingered, others faded quickly. Physical altercations occurred, but they were risky. Injury could end one's livelihood. Most disputes burned hot and brief, extinguished by exhaustion rather than resolution. The presence of death continued to shape perspective. Losses were mourned but not prolonged publicly. Life required forward motion. Grief was folded into routine because there was little alternative. Community support existed, though it was practical rather than sentimental. Assistance meant food, labor, or shelter, not extended consolation. Seasonal cycles dictated energy. Winter compressed life inward. Summer allowed brief expansion. Spring and autumn were transitional, marked by mud, uncertainty, and adjustment. You marked years by what survived each season: roofs that held, health that endured, supplies that lasted just long enough. As you continued surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, optimism became quieter. It no longer looked like improvement, but like stability. Fewer disruptions, familiar faces still present, work that continued. This was enough to sustain effort. Hope, when it appeared, was cautious and limited in scope. Life did not become easier, but it became manageable. And in a city that offered so little comfort, manageability was not failure. It was success measured realistically. You kept going not because conditions improved, but because stopping was not an option. And so you adapted, day after day, in ways that were unremarkable, effective, and quietly sufficient. By this point, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh was less a conscious effort and more a set of habits that operated without much reflection. You no longer compared your life to an ideal version of comfort, because that comparison had stopped being useful. Instead, you measured success by smaller indicators. You stayed warm enough, you ate regularly enough, you avoided serious injury. These were acceptable outcomes. Your relationship with the city itself became practical. You knew which routes flooded after rain and which staircases became slippery in winter. You adjusted your pace accordingly. Walking was not exercise or leisure. It was transport, and efficiency mattered. You conserved energy by moving deliberately, avoiding unnecessary detours, and stopping only when required. Rest was something you took when circumstances allowed, not when you felt the need. Light dictated productivity. Candles were expensive and oil lamps required maintenance. Most work happened during daylight, which meant winter shortened both income and opportunity. Evenings were quieter, not from choice, but from limitation. Activities slowed, conversations softened, and people prepared for rest earlier than modern schedules would allow. Sleep was fragmented, but it was necessary. Exhaustion was not a condition to be solved, but a signal to stop. Maintenance occupied much of daily thought. Clothes required mending, shoes needed repair, and tools demanded care. Replacing items was costly, so preservation mattered. You learned basic repair skills whether or not they interested you. Small failures left unaddressed often became larger problems later, and later was rarely more convenient. Weather was never background information. It shaped decisions constantly. Rain changed routes, slowed work, and increased illness. Cold limited dexterity and endurance. Wind carried smoke and odors unpredictably through the city. You dressed with caution, layered carefully, and accepted that no choice was entirely correct. Being slightly uncomfortable was preferable to being unprepared. Social ties remained essential. No one survived alone, not effectively. Borrowing, sharing, and exchanging favors were normal, not signs of weakness. Independence was admired in theory, but cooperation was required in practice. You kept track of obligations mentally, repaying them when able. Reputation mattered quietly. Reliability earned support. Unreliability reduced options. Legal matters hovered in the background of daily life. Contracts were informal, disputes common, and enforcement inconsistent. Most people avoided courts unless necessary. Resolution through negotiation or compromise was faster and less risky. The law existed, but it did not operate evenly, and understanding its limits was part of survival. Public events punctuated monotony. Executions, proclamations, and religious gatherings drew crowds. These moments were somber rather than entertaining. They reminded residents of authority, order, and consequence. Attendance was often expected. Absence could draw attention. Watching became part of civic duty, reinforcing awareness of boundaries. Aging changed one's relationship with labor. Strength declined, speed slowed, and tasks required more effort. Older residents shifted into roles that relied on experience rather than endurance when possible. Not everyone managed this transition. Those who could not adjust faced increasing vulnerability. There were no formal retirements. Work continued as long as the body allowed. Mental resilience developed gradually. People learned not to dwell on discomfort because dwelling consumed energy without producing change. Complaints existed, but they were brief and familiar. Humor remained dry and observational. Sarcasm softened frustration. Laughter was restrained but effective. It acknowledged difficulty without amplifying it. Time continued its steady passage. Children grew into workers. Neighbors disappeared. Buildings aged alongside their occupants. Change was visible but slow. Innovations arrived gradually, often resisted at first, then absorbed without ceremony. Progress was incremental and uneven. Expectations adjusted accordingly. As you continued surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you stopped thinking of survival as temporary. This was not a phase to endure before improvement arrived. This was life as it was structured. You adapted not with enthusiasm, but with competence. You did what was necessary, avoided what was dangerous, and accepted what could not be altered. And while this existence lacked comfort, it was not entirely without meaning. Familiar routines, shared hardship, and small moments of stability created a sense of continuity. You lived within narrow margins, but you learned how to navigate them. Survival did not feel dramatic. It felt repetitive, constrained, and quietly demanding. And somehow, that steadiness was enough to carry you forward, one unremarkable day at a time. By now, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh meant you rarely thought in terms of comfort at all. Comfort implied choice, and choice was limited. Instead, you thought in terms of continuity. What could be repeated tomorrow without creating new problems? What habits kept things from getting worse? Improvement was subtle enough to be invisible most days. Space remained a constant negotiation. Rooms did not belong to single purposes. Sleeping, eating, working, and storing goods all happened in the same area, often within arm's reach of someone else doing something entirely different. Personal boundaries were implied rather than enforced. You learned to ignore noise, movement, and conversation that did not concern you because acknowledging everything would have been exhausting. Furniture was sparse and durable, chairs were wooden, tables scarred by years of use, and storage consisted of chests rather than shelves. Nothing matched, and nothing was decorative unless it also served a function. Items accumulated slowly and disappeared just as quietly, worn down rather than replaced. Ownership felt temporary, even when it lasted decades. Water continued to shape daily schedules. Fetching it took time and effort, and wastewater had to go somewhere afterward. Spills were common. Floors stayed damp. Mold was familiar, but unnamed. The idea of running water indoors would have sounded extravagant, possibly irresponsible. Carrying what you needed reminded you of its value. Waste was minimized not by principle but by effort. Food safety was uncertain, so caution replaced confidence. Meat was inspected visually and by smell. Bread was stretched with fillers. Milk soured quickly. Preservation methods were imperfect. Illness from spoiled food happened often enough to be accepted as risk rather than accident. When stomachs settled and fevers passed, people returned to routine without commentary. Markets doubled as social indicators. Prices reflected not only supply, but rumor. A failed harvest elsewhere rippled inward. War news changed availability. Weather delayed shipments. You learned to read faces as much as stalls. A vendor's tone could warn you more effectively than posted prices. Awareness saved money. Inattention cost it. Clothing marked status subtly. Cuts, colors, and fabric quality mattered, but extravagance was rare. Repairs were visible and expected. A patched sleeve did not signal poverty so much as practicality. Keeping clothes intact mattered more than keeping them new. Appearance aimed for adequacy, not impression. Community obligations remained informal but binding. These included watching children, sharing tools, lending space, or standing witness during disputes. Refusing without reason damaged trust. Trust functioned as currency, quietly exchanged and carefully protected. Reputation followed you through the close faster than you could correct it. Illness in one household affected many. Care extended outward because isolation was difficult. Neighbors brought food, fetched water, or took on chores temporarily. This support was not sentimental, it was preventive. Helping now reduced burden later. Everyone understood the logic. Religious observance continued to frame weeks and years. Attendance was expected. Behavior was monitored. Moral guidance emphasized restraint and humility, which aligned conveniently with existing conditions. Sermons offered explanations rather than solutions. They reassured listeners that endurance was virtuous and that relief might come elsewhere eventually. Leisure existed in brief, unplanned moments. A shared joke, a song remembered, a warm drink at the right time. These were not scheduled or advertised. They happened when conditions aligned. Their rarity made them noticeable but not transformative. Life resumed its usual shape immediately afterward. Children adapted quickly. They learned routes, routines, and responsibilities early. Play happened around work, not instead of it. Imagination filled gaps where resources were lacking. Scraps became toys. Stories filled evenings. Resilience was taught indirectly by necessity rather than instruction. As you aged further into this life, memory became selective. The worst days faded first, replaced by patterns. You remembered how things worked, not how they felt. This made continuation easier. Nostalgia did not soften the past, it simply simplified it. The city itself continued unchanged in its essential character. Stone endured. Streets shifted slightly. New residents arrived and adapted in familiar ways. Change did occur, but slowly enough to feel theoretical. Daily life remained grounded in repetition. To keep surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you focused on predictability. You avoided novelty unless required. You conserved energy and attention. You accepted small discomforts to avoid larger ones. This was not resignation, it was strategy. Life narrowed, but within those boundaries it functioned, and as long as it functioned, there was no urgent reason to imagine it differently. At this stage, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh meant understanding that time itself behaved differently. Days were long when measured by effort, but short when measured by change. You did not expect novelty, you expected repetition, and repetition provided a strange kind of stability. The city aged alongside its residents. Stone darkened, stair edges softened, and familiar cracks widened gradually. Repairs were reactive rather than preventive. Something was fixed when it failed, not before. This approach applied to buildings, tools, and bodies. You waited until a problem demanded attention, then addressed it with whatever resources were available. Hygiene practices remained limited, but they followed their own internal logic. Hands were washed when visibly dirty. Faces were wiped in the morning. Full bathing happened rarely and was considered demanding rather than refreshing. Cleanliness was defined by function, not by scent. If you could work, you were clean enough. The presence of animals remained constant. Horses powered transport, dogs guarded or scavenged, and cats maintained an uneasy truce with rodents. Livestock passed through streets regularly. Their sounds and smells blended into daily background noise. Human and animal spaces overlapped without much separation. Avoiding contact entirely was unrealistic. Noise management became instinctive. You learned to filter sound, identifying which voices or crashes required attention and which could be ignored. This skill was essential for rest. Without it, exhaustion accumulated quickly. Sleep came in layers rather than hours, built from moments of quiet scattered through the night. Lighting conditions shaped mood. Candlelight softened edges and reduced visibility, which had the unintended effect of lowering expectations. Imperfections were easier to tolerate in dimness. Evening shadows hid clutter and wear. Darkness simplified the environment, even as it introduced risk. Work rhythms remained tied to physical limits. Brazilian work ethic had no place here. Fatigue ended productivity regardless of intent. Pushing past exhaustion increased mistakes, and mistakes carried cost. Efficiency meant stopping before damage occurred. This applied equally to labor, conversation, and conflict. Social hierarchies continued to govern interaction. Titles mattered, age mattered, gender mattered. You learned to read these cues quickly and adjust behavior accordingly. Misjudging status could result in embarrassment or loss of opportunity. Navigating hierarchy was not dramatic, it was routine. Public punishment retained its role as warning. Even when rarely witnessed directly, its possibility shaped behavior. Order relied more on observation than enforcement. People explained rules to one another through example rather than instruction. Boundaries were absorbed gradually. Markets and trade remained unpredictable. Shortages occurred without notice. Prices rose suddenly. Hoarding was discouraged socially but practiced quietly. Planning involved guesswork. You stocked when you could, not when it was ideal. Flexibility mattered more than foresight. Domestic work filled hours invisibly. Cleaning, cooking, mending, and organizing did not end. Completion was temporary. Tasks repeated endlessly, resetting each day. Progress was not cumulative, it was cyclical. Accepting this prevented frustration. Relationships deepened through shared endurance. People bonded less over mutual interests and more over mutual tolerance. Knowing someone would show up reliably mattered more than enjoying their company. Dependability built trust. Trust reduced risk. Festive occasions remained rare but meaningful. They interrupted routine without dismantling it. Decorations were modest. Celebrations ended early. Joy was contained to fit circumstances. Excess was avoided not by rule but by consequence. As years accumulated, ambition softened. You still worked, still planned, still hoped in limited ways. But goals became local. A roof that held, a child who survived, a trade that continued. These were sufficient markers of success. To keep surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you learned not to fight the city's pace. Resistance wasted energy. Acceptance conserved it. You adapted expectations downward and skills upward, finding balance between effort and outcome. The city never rewarded optimism, but it tolerated persistence. And persistence, practiced quietly and daily, was enough to keep life moving forward without drawing attention, which, under the circumstances, was the safest outcome available. By this point in surviving 1700s Edinburgh, you had learned that longevity was not about strength or cleverness. It was about restraint. Knowing when not to act mattered as much as knowing what to do. The city punished impatience more reliably than ignorance. Daily decisions were filtered through experience. You no longer questioned whether to leave the house during heavy rain. You knew the answer. You did not argue with weather, darkness, or fatigue. You adjusted around them. Adaptation was quieter than resistance and far more effective. Household rhythms continued without ceremony. Fires were lit carefully because fuel was expensive and mistakes were costly. Ashes were collected, stored, and discarded with purpose. Nothing involving fire was casual. A moment of carelessness could erase years of effort. This awareness shaped behavior subtly, keeping movements deliberate and focused. Storage space remained limited, so accumulation was controlled. Objects had to justify their presence. If something did not serve a clear purpose, it eventually left, often passed to someone else who needed it more. Ownership was practical rather than sentimental. Items were valued for reliability, not novelty. Work identities hardened over time. You became known for what you did, and changing that perception was difficult. Skills defined reputation. Consistency built trust. Errors lingered longer than successes. The city remembered failure clearly and forgave it slowly. Precision and predictability became protective traits. Street life maintained its constant flow. Vendors rotated, faces aged. Newcomers arrived with unfamiliar habits and learned quickly to adjust. Watching this cycle reinforced the sense that the city absorbed individuals without changing itself. You were part of the pattern, not an exception to it. Health remained unpredictable. A strong body one month could fail the next. Chronic aches were accepted as background noise. You worked around them. Pain was noted, then accommodated. Complaints were reserved for sudden changes, not ongoing discomfort. This was not stoicism. It was economy of attention. Medical care remained limited, but folk knowledge circulated steadily. Remedies were shared, debated, and adjusted through observation. Some helped, some did nothing. Some caused harm. Over time, households curated their own collections of practices, refined by experience rather than theory. Survival favored caution and moderation. Public cleanliness campaigns appeared occasionally, often in response to outbreaks or pressure from authorities. These efforts produced short-term improvements and long-term fatigue. Participation varied. Enthusiasm faded quickly. The city returned to baseline conditions with little resistance. Change required sustained effort, which was difficult to maintain. Children continued to absorb the city's logic without explanation. They learned routes, risks, and rules by watching. Instruction was brief and situational. Mistakes were corrected quickly. Learning was immediate and practical. By adolescence, most understood how to navigate the city efficiently, if not comfortably. Communication remained face-to-face. Letters existed but moved slowly. News traveled unevenly. Rumors filled gaps. Verification was rare. You learned to evaluate information based on source and tone rather than content alone. Confidence mattered. Hesitation signaled uncertainty. Survival depended on reading people as much as facts. Seasonal labor cycles shaped opportunity. Certain work intensified in warmer months while winter reduced options. Planning accounted for this imbalance. You saved when possible and spent carefully when necessary. Financial resilience meant anticipating scarcity rather than hoping to avoid it. Community disputes followed familiar arcs. Tension built quietly, surfaced briefly, then settled into new arrangements. Public confrontation was inefficient. Private negotiation worked better. Third-party mediation was common. Solutions prioritized continuity over fairness. Keeping things functioning mattered more than assigning blame. Spiritual beliefs continued to offer structure. Faith provided explanations where logic failed. It reassured people that suffering fit into a larger order, even if that order remained abstract. This belief reduced anxiety without eliminating hardship. It allowed endurance without demanding understanding. As age advanced, memory simplified experience. Hardships blurred together, forming a general sense of difficulty rather than specific events. What remained clear were routines that worked. You repeated them. Innovation felt risky without obvious benefit. Stability became preference rather than necessity. The city remained consistent in its indifference. It did not reward effort, but it acknowledged persistence. Those who endured quietly earned space, familiarity, and a degree of predictability. These were not prizes, but they mattered. To keep surviving in 1700s Edinburgh, you focused on maintaining equilibrium. You avoided extremes, you managed resources carefully, you accepted limitations without resentment. Life continued not because conditions improved, but because you adjusted faster than they worsened. And in a place where change moved slowly and discomfort was constant, that ability to adapt without complaint was the closest thing to success the city offered. By this stage, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh was almost entirely instinctual. Your body and mind had adapted to the city's rhythms. You no longer noticed the cold until it became extreme. You navigated narrow staircases and muddy streets without thinking. Survival had become a pattern ingrained through repetition rather than conscious effort. Household life remained structured around necessity. Cooking, cleaning, and maintenance occupied much of your attention. Each task had its proper sequence, honed over years of trial and error. Deviating from routine often resulted in wasted effort or small misfortunes. Familiarity with these rhythms reduced errors and preserved energy. Food habits were predictable but efficient. Breakfast was minimal, lunch was practical. Dinner provided enough warmth and sustenance to continue. Ingredients were limited by season, market availability, and cost. You ate what you could store or purchase. Culinary creativity was rare, not because people lacked interest, but because survival demanded simplicity and reliability. Noise persisted, yet you filtered it automatically. Street vendors, neighbors, animals, and construction formed a constant backdrop. You did not hear them consciously unless something required attention. Rest depended on selective attention. Sleep was often fragmented, but adequate enough to maintain daily function. Water and waste remained challenges. Fetching water required time and effort, and drainage systems were inadequate. Floors and streets stayed damp. Hygiene was functional rather than aspirational. Diseases circulated readily, but careful habits reduced exposure. You learned to clean just enough, wash hands when practical, and accept imperfections. Trade and markets dictated minor patterns in life. Prices fluctuated unexpectedly. Availability of goods varied. You adjusted by buying what was accessible, storing when possible, and improvising when necessary. Planning was practical, conservative, and reactive. Flexibility was valued above ambition. Social hierarchies influenced almost every interaction. Respect, deference, and observation governed behavior. Misjudging authority or status had consequences. Reputation traveled quickly through the close. Being reliable earned trust. Being careless invited scrutiny or restriction. Navigating social space was as essential as physical survival. Medical knowledge remained limited. Illnesses appeared suddenly. Remedies were inconsistent. Families relied on tradition, observation, and experience. Treatments ranged from harmless to harmful. The best defense was prevention, hygiene, caution, and attention to environment. Awareness outweighed intervention. Community support persisted as a quiet necessity. Neighbors assisted each other with labor, childcare, or care during sickness. Support was practical, not sentimental. Obligations were remembered, repaid when possible, and formed the fabric of daily life. Isolation increased risk. Participation in networks reduced it. Religion continued to shape routines and understanding. Services, rituals, and moral expectations structured life. Faith provided explanations for suffering, reassurance for endurance, and guidance for behavior. These spiritual frameworks allowed people to tolerate hardship without despair. Children grew into city life with surprising ease. They adapted to routines, understood risks, and learned tasks quickly. Play existed but was brief and intertwined with chores. Education emphasized practical skill rather than theory. Survival skills were passed naturally from parent to child. Seasons dictated opportunity and risk. Winter restricted labor and movement. Summer increased work and exposure. Planning required awareness of environmental cycles. Resilience depended on observation and adaptation rather than prediction or hope. By now, life had narrowed into patterns. Comfort was rare. Threats were frequent. Yet, by maintaining routines, respecting limits, and observing carefully, survival was achievable. Small victories, remaining healthy, keeping possessions intact, navigating streets safely accumulated into a quiet stability. Ultimately, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh was not heroic or adventurous. It was repetitive, constrained, and uneventful. Success meant continuing without significant mishap, enduring discomfort, and adapting quietly. The city demanded persistence, patience, and pragmatism. And those who practiced these quietly day after day found that life, though far from easy, remained possible. By the time you reached middle age in 1700s Edinburgh, survival had become routine rather than conscious effort. You knew the patterns of the city, the smells, the sounds, the places to avoid, and moved through it with minimal attention. Habits replaced decisions. You acted with foresight, but foresight was guided by experience rather than theory. Mistakes were rare because you had learned which situations consistently caused trouble. The home remained a place of continuous maintenance. Fires were lit cautiously, fuel rationed carefully. Floors were swept and patched. Water was hauled and stored. Tasks were repetitive and never fully complete, but each cycle reinforced competence. Efficiency mattered more than comfort, and diligence mattered more than speed. You measured accomplishment not by novelty, but by avoiding preventable misfortune. Food was functional. Meals were simple, filling, and repetitive. Bread, porridge, stews, and the occasional preserved meat formed the bulk of consumption. Spices were minimal, flavor was secondary, nutrition and satiety mattered. You learned to plan for scarcity, stretching supplies when necessary. Spoilage was common, so caution dictated preparation, storage, and consumption. Noise had become background. Street sounds, animal calls, and neighbor activity were filtered automatically. Sleep adapted to interruption, rest was segmented but sufficient. Attention was directed only when events threatened continuity: spilled water, collapsing stairs, sudden illness. Everything else faded into rhythm. Social structures continued to define interactions. Respect, observation, and deference guided behavior. Misjudging authority or status had consequences that ranged from embarrassment to practical harm. Reputation traveled through the clothes rapidly. Dependable individuals gained subtle advantages. Reckless ones endured difficulty. Survival required reading people as carefully as streets. Health remained fragile, yet predictable. Chronic aches, minor fevers, and lingering fatigue were normalized. Major illness was feared. Remedies combined tradition, experience, and luck. Care was provided mostly at home, with neighbors assisting as needed. Preventive habits, hand washing, food inspection, proper clothing were quietly essential. Awareness was more valuable than intervention. Children integrated into life seamlessly. They assumed responsibilities early, learning routes, routines, and household tasks. Play was brief, embedded in work. Education focused on practicality. Observation taught as much as instruction. Skill and endurance were rewarded through survival rather than praise. Mistakes were corrected swiftly to prevent accumulation. Community support persisted as understated necessity. Shared labor, childcare, and assistance during illness maintained social equilibrium. Obligations were remembered, repaid, and quietly reinforced. Participation in these networks reduced risk. Isolation increased it. Bonds were functional but essential. Religious life maintained subtle influence. Services, moral guidance, and ritual marked time and behavior. Faith offered explanations and reassurance without changing circumstances. Endurance became a virtue, framed as moral practice. People relied on structure and guidance as much as on food or fire. Seasons dictated labor and planning. Winter limited movement and opportunity. Summer increased both. Awareness of environmental cycles guided work, storage, and preparation. You learned to anticipate shortages, slow work, and conserve resources accordingly. By now, life had narrowed into manageable patterns. Comfort remained rare, danger was consistent, and persistence was necessary. Success consisted in continuing, avoiding major mishaps, and adapting quietly to the environment. Repetition and observation replaced strategy, and prudence replaced ambition. Survival in 1700s Edinburgh was not heroic. It was steady, restrained, and for those who persisted, quietly sufficient. Daily life demanded resilience, patience, and modest expectations, and those who endured without complaint or dramatics discovered that life, though narrow and constrained, was still possible. As you moved further into adulthood, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh required increasing reliance on routine. Every day resembled the last, with subtle variations dictated by weather, work, and the health of neighbors. The city imposed continuity whether you wanted it or not. Your movements, choices, and energy became governed less by desire and more by practicality. Morning began with preparation rather than awakening. Clothes were layered, fires lit, water fetched, and meals arranged. Each step was deliberate. Efficiency was paramount because effort expended unnecessarily was effort lost. The cold was constant but manageable. Damp floors and drafty windows had long ceased to provoke complaint. You adjusted naturally to discomfort. Food remained functional and repetitive. Bread, porridge, and occasional stews were staples. Preservation dictated consumption. Spoiled items were removed quickly. Meal preparation was methodical, learned through repetition rather than instruction. Taste was secondary to sustenance. Planning meals around availability, storage, and effort became instinct. Neighborhood observation remained crucial. You watched for disruptions, illness, or danger. Noise was filtered. Only significant events drew attention. Understanding which occurrences required action and which could be ignored was essential. Energy and focus were limited. Misallocation had consequences. Attention was a resource to conserve. Work persisted in cycles of labor and fatigue, tasks repeated daily, maintenance, crafting, transporting, and repairing. Progress was incremental and often imperceptible. The value lay in continuation rather than improvement. Completing the day without incident was more important than efficiency or skill development. Safety and predictability mattered. Social interaction remained governed by hierarchy and reputation. Deference to status, observation of customs, and awareness of relationships dictated behavior. Missteps were remembered. Trustworthiness and reliability opened subtle opportunities. Survival demanded understanding others as keenly as the environment. Disruption of social norms was risky. Health was fragile and routines protected it. Minor aches, fatigue, and recurring illness were normal. Serious illness or injury could disrupt stability. Remedies were limited, combining folk knowledge and observation. Prevention mattered more than treatment. Clothing, hygiene, diet, and rest became tools of survival. Vigilance was habitual. Children contributed early. They absorbed tasks, risks, and routines seamlessly. Education was practical. Observational learning replaced formal instruction. Play existed only alongside labor. Skills were reinforced through necessity. Success was measured by endurance, adaptability, and usefulness. Mistakes were corrected promptly. Community support persisted quietly. Neighbors assisted with chores, illness, and emergencies. Obligations were understood and repaid. Isolation increased vulnerability. Participation in these informal networks provided stability. Bonds were functional, reliable, and understated. Religious observance offered structure and reassurance. Rituals, moral guidance, and communal expectations influenced behavior. Faith provided explanation where logic did not. Endurance became a virtue, framing hardship as meaningful. Structure offered predictability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Seasons shaped life decisively. Winter compressed activity, limited labor, and increased reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded opportunity but introduced hazards. Awareness of environmental cycles dictated planning, preparation, and daily decisions. Resilience involved adapting to these cycles quietly and consistently. Over time, life narrowed further. Comfort remained minimal, disruption constant, and persistence essential. Survival meant repetition, observation, and restraint. Daily routines replaced ambition. Prudence replaced expectation. Small successes, maintaining health, navigating streets safely, preserving resources, became markers of achievement. By this point, surviving in Edinburgh was an exercise in endurance rather than improvement. Daily existence demanded patience, attention, and adaptation. Life was narrow, constrained, and predictable. Yet within these boundaries it functioned. Continuity, more than comfort or novelty, defined success. And for those who persisted day after unremarkable day, existence remained possible. As you continued into later adulthood, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh became almost entirely habitual. You moved through the city with practiced awareness, avoiding the worst mud, recognizing the signs of illness, and knowing which streets were safer in rain. Decisions became instinctive. Experience guided choices more reliably than thought. The city had taught you what mattered and what could be ignored. Home life retained its endless cycles of maintenance. Fires were carefully managed, floors swept, and water hauled. Rooms remained multifunctional, serving as kitchens, bedrooms, and workshops simultaneously. Comfort was minimal, but efficiency maximized functionality. Habits governed activity, ensuring survival rather than enjoyment. You had long since accepted that novelty was unnecessary and risk was unwelcome. Food was predictable and unremarkable. Breakfast consisted of simple fare, lunch was often consumed hurriedly, and dinner offered warmth and sustenance. Variety was limited, flavor incidental. Preservation and availability dictated consumption more than desire. Hunger was managed, not indulged, and spoilage was handled pragmatically. Cooking was labor-intensive, repetitive, and required attention to prevent waste. Noise had become background, filtered automatically by habit. Footsteps, animals, and neighbors blended into the daily auditory landscape. Sleep adapted to fragmentation. Rest occurred in short intervals when possible. Vigilance remained, but only for events that threatened continuity: a collapsed roof, a sudden illness, or a blocked street. Most sounds were ignored by necessity, not preference. Work persisted steadily, tasks repeated in familiar cycles: repair, transport, trade, and maintenance. Outcomes were measured by continuity rather than improvement. Completing tasks safely mattered more than efficiency or skill enhancement. The city rewarded those who maintained stability rather than those who sought novelty. Energy was carefully rationed to maximize survival. Social structures remained integral. Status, deference, and reputation shaped interactions. Misjudging authority or ignoring norms brought consequences. Trust and reliability were quietly acknowledged and rewarded. Observing relationships and maintaining obligations was essential. Disruption was risky. Conformity ensured survival. Health required constant vigilance. Chronic aches, fatigue, and minor illnesses were routine. Serious illness threatened stability. Remedies remained limited, blending folk practice and observation. Prevention, attention to clothing, diet, hygiene, and rest rather than intervention-dominated strategy. Awareness was survival's most reliable tool. Children continued to adapt naturally. They learned tasks, routines, and risk management through observation and participation. Play existed but was integrated with labor. Education emphasized utility over theory. Skills were reinforced daily. Success was measured by endurance, adaptation, and contribution to household stability. Mistakes were corrected immediately to prevent compounding. Community remained a subtle support network. Neighbors assisted with labor, emergencies, and childcare. Obligations were mutual and understood. Isolation increased risk. Participation ensured security. Bonds were functional and understated, yet essential for continuity. Religion provided framework and reassurance. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation structured life. Faith offered explanations for suffering, encouraging endurance. It reduced anxiety and framed hardship as meaningful. Structure became a tool for maintaining equilibrium. Seasons dictated daily life. Winter compressed activity, limited work, and heightened reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded opportunity, but introduced hazards. Adaptation to seasonal cycles was vital for survival. Planning, preparation, and awareness were continuous tasks, quietly practiced. Life had narrowed into enduring patterns. Comfort remained scarce, danger constant, persistence required. Survival depended on repetition, observation, and restraint. Daily routines replaced ambition, prudence replaced expectation. Small successes maintaining health, navigating streets, conserving resources were the measures of life. By now, survival was less conscious effort than ingrained habit. Existence was narrow, constrained, predictable. Yet within those limits, life functioned. Continuity, rather than comfort, defined achievement. And for those who persisted day after unremarkable day, life, though constrained and repetitive, remained possible. As you entered the later stages of life in 1700s Edinburgh, the routines that had once required attention now flowed almost automatically. You navigated streets, stairs, and markets with practiced ease. Survival was no longer a conscious challenge. It was a pattern ingrained through decades of repetition. Risk was calculated, effort rationed, and energy conserved wherever possible. Homes remained functional, not comfortable. Fires were tended efficiently, floors swept and patched, water collected and stored with care. Rooms served multiple purposes. Cooking, eating, sleeping, and work all occurred within the same space. Comfort was incidental. Efficiency and reliability were essential. Life had become a sequence of habitual actions designed to maintain stability. Food continued to be practical. Meals were predictable: porridge, bread, stews, preserved meat. Variety was minimal, flavor incidental. Hunger was managed rather than enjoyed. Cooking was labor-intensive, repetitive, and required attention to avoid waste or illness. Spoilage dictated vigilance, not taste. Planning was modest, focused on survival rather than indulgence. Noise remained constant but largely unnoticed. Footsteps, animal sounds, and neighbors' activities blended into the background. Sleep was fragmented but adequate. Attention was reserved for events that posed immediate danger. Collapsing structures, sudden illness, blocked streets. Most sounds were filtered out instinctively, conserving focus and energy. Work persisted steadily in predictable cycles. Tasks repeated daily: maintenance, repair, transport, trade. Outcomes were measured by continuity, not improvement. Completing tasks safely mattered more than efficiency or skill enhancement. Stability was rewarded, novelty was risky, and energy management was crucial. Social norms continued to govern interactions. Hierarchy, status, and reputation shaped daily life. Missteps had consequences. Reliability and observation earned subtle advantages. Trust was a functional tool, obligations were maintained quietly, and deviations were penalized indirectly. Social navigation was as vital as physical survival. Health was precarious, yet managed through experience. Chronic aches, fatigue, and minor illness were accepted as background. Major illness posed real threat. Remedies were limited. Folk knowledge, observation, and cautious experimentation. Prevention, careful clothing, hygiene, diet, and rest were central to enduring daily life. Awareness remained the key tool. Children integrated naturally into routines. They assumed responsibilities early, learned city logistics, and acquired survival skills by observation. Play existed only alongside labor. Education emphasized utility over theory. Mistakes were corrected swiftly to prevent compounded consequences. Success was measured by endurance and contribution rather than pleasure or achievement. Community support remained understated but vital. Neighbors assisted with work, childcare, and illness. Obligations were reciprocal and understood. Isolation increased risk. Participation ensured continuity. Bonds were functional and subtle, yet crucial for survival. Religious observance continued to structure life. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation framed daily behavior. Faith offered explanations for suffering and justification for endurance. It reassured residents that hardship had meaning and encouraged perseverance without changing circumstances. Seasonal cycles dictated activity. Winter compressed work, limited movement, and increased reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded opportunity but brought exposure and risk. Awareness of these cycles governed planning, preparation, and labor. Adaptation was quiet, consistent, and habitual. By now, life had narrowed into a continuous sequence of repetition and adaptation. Comfort was minimal, danger consistent, and persistence necessary. Survival depended on maintaining routine, observing carefully, and exercising restraint. Small successes, remaining healthy, preserving resources, navigating streets constituted achievement. Ultimately, life in 1700s Edinburgh was unremarkable yet enduring. Stability, rather than excitement, defined existence. Repetition and careful adaptation allowed persistence. Those who endured, quietly and consistently, found that even within narrow, constrained circumstances, life remained possible. As years passed, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh became a quiet mastery of routine. Each day resembled the last, and each variation was subtle, dictated by weather, work, and health. You moved with familiarity through streets and closes, avoiding hazards automatically. Survival was instinctual rather than conscious. Patterns replaced choice, and habits guided attention more reliably than thought. Household life remained labor-intensive and continuous. Fires were lit and tended, floors swept, water hauled and stored, meals prepared and served. Rooms served multiple functions: cooking, eating, sleeping, and work. Comfort was incidental, efficiency was essential. Habits maintained stability rather than pleasure. Novelty was avoided, risk minimized. Food remained practical and repetitive. Meals were simple: porridge, bread, stews, preserved meat. Variety was limited, flavor incidental. Hunger was managed, not enjoyed. Cooking required care to prevent waste and illness. Preservation dictated consumption and timing. Planning was minimal, focused solely on survival. Noise was constant but filtered instinctively. Footsteps, animals, vendors, and neighbors blended into the background. Sleep was fragmented but adequate. Attention was reserved for events that threatened continuity: a sudden illness, a blocked street, a structural failure. Most sounds were ignored by habit, conserving energy and focus. Work cycles persisted predictably. Maintenance, transport, trade, and repair occupied daily schedules. Outcomes were measured by continuity rather than improvement. Completing tasks safely was more important than speed or skill enhancement. Stability was rewarded. Novelty was risky. Energy conservation guided every action. Social norms remained critical. Hierarchy, status, and reputation shaped behavior. Misjudging authority or ignoring custom brought consequences. Trust and reliability conferred subtle advantages. Observing and maintaining obligations quietly ensured continuity. Deviations introduced unnecessary risk. Health was managed with caution. Chronic aches and minor illness were normalized. Serious illness threatened stability. Remedies were limited and practical. Prevention through clothing, hygiene, diet, and rest was more effective than treatment. Awareness and attention remained essential survival tools. Children learned city life naturally. Responsibilities, roots, and skills were absorbed through observation. Play existed alongside chores, not instead of them. Education emphasized utility over theory. Mistakes were corrected immediately to avoid compounding problems. Endurance and usefulness defined success. Community remained a subtle support network. Neighbors assisted with labor, childcare, and illness. Obligations were mutual and understood. Isolation increased vulnerability. Participation in these networks preserved stability. Bonds were functional, understated, and essential. Religious practice continued to structure time and behavior. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectations framed life. Faith offered explanations for hardship and reinforced endurance. It reassured residents that suffering had meaning and encouraged perseverance without materially altering circumstances. Seasons dictated activity. Winter compressed work, restricted movement, and increased reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded opportunity but introduced exposure and risk. Awareness of seasonal cycles guided planning and labor. Adaptation was habitual, quiet, and consistent. Life had narrowed into repetition and adaptation. Comfort remained scarce, hazards were constant, and persistence was necessary. Survival relied on maintaining routines, careful observation, and restraint. Small victories, preserving health, navigating streets safely, managing resources constituted success. Ultimately, living in 1700s Edinburgh was unremarkable, yet sustainable. Repetition, careful adaptation, and endurance allowed life to continue. Those who persisted quietly discovered that within narrow, constrained circumstances, life, though limited, remained possible. As age advanced further, survival in 1700s Edinburgh became almost entirely a matter of quiet endurance. The city's rhythms were familiar, almost predictable, and you moved through them automatically. Hazards, discomforts, and inconveniences were absorbed into daily life. Energy was conserved, habits dictated action, and conscious thought focused only on unexpected threats. Household routines dominated daily life. Fires were lit and monitored, floors swept, water collected and stored, and meals prepared with attention to preservation. Rooms served multiple purposes, sleeping, eating, working, without complaint or ceremony. Comfort remained incidental. Efficiency and functionality defined living spaces. Repetition guaranteed survival. Food was consistent, practical, and minimally varied. Bread, porridge, and stews were standard. Preservation dictated choices. Taste was secondary to nourishment. Spoiled items were removed quickly, and planning centered on availability and resource management. Hunger was managed, not indulged. Meals maintained strength, not enjoyment. Noise persisted, but your perception filtered it automatically. Street activity, animals, neighbors, and commerce became background. Sleep occurred in fragments, yet sufficed. Attention focused on threats to continuity, illness, obstruction, or accidents. Unimportant sounds faded into habit, conserving energy and focus. Daily work cycles continued predictably. Tasks, maintenance, transport, repair, and trade were repetitive. Success was measured by continuity, not improvement. Completing tasks safely outweighed speed or skill advancement. Stability was rewarded, novelty avoided, and energy carefully allocated to essential activity. Social structure maintained its quiet authority. Hierarchy, reputation, and obligation influenced interaction. Misjudgments carried consequences. Reliability earned subtle advantage, while deviation increased vulnerability. Observation and understanding of social cues were survival tools, equal to navigation or resource management. Health required constant management. Minor illnesses and chronic aches were normalized. Serious disease threatened stability. Remedies were practical and mostly preventive: hygiene, clothing, diet, and rest. Awareness of body and environment remained vital to endurance. Children integrated into household and city life naturally. Responsibilities were learned early, skills absorbed through observation, and mistakes corrected quickly. Play existed alongside work. Practical knowledge took precedence over theoretical education. Endurance and contribution defined success. Community functioned as quiet support. Neighbors assisted with labor, childcare, and illness. Obligations were recognized and reciprocated. Isolation increased risk, participation reduced it. Social bonds were understated yet essential to survival. Religious observance provided structure and reassurance. Ritual, moral expectation, and communal activity shaped behavior. Faith offered explanation and framed endurance as virtue. It reassured residents that hardship had meaning and encouraged persistence. Seasons dictated rhythm. Winter restricted work, movement, and activity. Summer allowed expansion but increased exposure. Awareness of seasonal patterns guided preparation, labor, and resource allocation. Adaptation was subtle, habitual, and constant. Life had condensed into repetition, observation, and endurance. Comfort remained limited, hazards persisted, and persistence was essential. Daily routines, careful management, and restraint ensured survival. Small achievements, maintaining health, preserving resources, navigating streets marked continued existence. In the end, life in 1700s Edinburgh was neither exciting nor easy. It was steady, constrained, and defined by endurance. Yet for those who adapted quietly, day after unremarkable day, existence continued. And within this persistence, life, though narrow and limited, remained possible. At this stage, surviving in 1700s, Edinburgh was mostly a matter of learned patterns and quiet adaptation. Days blended into each other, distinguished only by subtle variations in weather, work demands, and the health of neighbors. Decisions became instinctive, risks were assessed automatically, energy carefully rationed, and attention focused only where necessary. Life was defined by continuity, not choice. Household maintenance consumed attention daily. Fires were lit, fuel rationed, floors swept, and water collected. Meals were prepared methodically, balancing preservation, nutrition, and effort. Rooms served multiple functions. Cooking, sleeping, and work all occurred in the same space. Comfort remained incidental. Efficiency and reliability dictated behavior. Routine was survival. Food remained repetitive and utilitarian. Bread, porridge, and stews dominated. Preservation determined consumption and scheduling. Taste was secondary to sustenance. Spoiled food was removed promptly. Planning centered on resource management rather than pleasure. Hunger was controlled, not indulgent. Noise persisted but was filtered automatically. Street activity, animals, neighbors, and market bustle blended into background. Sleep was segmented but sufficient. Attention was allocated to threats, sudden illness, structural failures, or blocked streets. The rest was ignored by habit, conserving energy and focus. Work followed predictable cycles. Maintenance, repair, transport, and trade filled days. Outcomes were measured by continuity, not efficiency. Completing tasks safely mattered more than skill or speed. Stability was rewarded, novelty was risky. Energy was carefully allocated to essential functions. Social norms shaped interactions. Hierarchy, reputation, and obligation dictated behavior. Misjudging authority or ignoring custom carried consequences. Reliability earned subtle advantage, deviation increased risk. Observation, understanding, and adherence became survival skills as vital as physical navigation. Health required vigilant management. Minor ailments and chronic aches were normalized, serious illness remained threatening. Remedies were practical and mostly preventive: hygiene, clothing, diet, rest. Awareness of body and environment remained essential. Prevention outweighed intervention. Children continued to integrate naturally. Responsibilities were assumed early, skills acquired by observation, mistakes corrected swiftly. Play existed alongside chores. Practical education dominated. Endurance and usefulness defined success. Household contribution was expected and measured. Community support persisted quietly. Neighbors assisted with labor, childcare, and illness. Obligations were acknowledged and reciprocated. Isolation increased risk. Participation provided security. Bonds were understated, functional yet essential to survival. Religious structure offered reassurance. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation framed behavior. Faith explained hardship and reinforced endurance, helping residents tolerate life without improvement. Structure and predictability provided a framework for coping. Seasons dictated activity and preparation. Winter restricted movement, work, and opportunity. Summer expanded labor, but increased exposure. Awareness of environmental cycles guided decisions and conserved energy. Adaptation was habitual and constant. Life had condensed into repetition, observation, and endurance. Comfort was minimal, hazards constant, persistence essential. Daily routines, careful management, and restraint ensured survival. Small victories, preserving health, navigating streets, maintaining resources, measured continued existence. Ultimately, living in 1700s Edinburgh was unremarkable but sustainable. Stability, rather than excitement, defined life. Those who persisted quietly day after day found that within narrow and constrained circumstances, existence, though limited, remained possible. By now, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh had become nearly automatic. Decades of repetition had trained body and mind alike. Streets, stairs, and alleys were memorized. Hazards and inconveniences were anticipated and navigated with minimal thought. Survival no longer demanded constant vigilance, it had become habit. Energy was conserved and attention reserved for deviations from the expected. Household routines continued without interruption. Fires were managed, floors swept, water hauled, and meals prepared with practiced efficiency. Rooms served multiple purposes. Sleeping, cooking, working, and comfort remained incidental. Efficiency dictated movement, timing, and effort. Novelty was unnecessary. Routine ensured continuity, which was the true measure of success. Food was predictable and functional. Bread, porridge, and stews formed the majority of meals. Preservation guided consumption. Taste was incidental. Spoilage was handled quickly. Planning centered on availability and resource management. Hunger was managed through foresight and habit. Meals provided strength for survival rather than enjoyment. Noise, once disruptive, had become background. Footsteps, animal sounds, neighbors, and commerce were filtered automatically. Sleep occurred in fragments yet sufficed. Attention was reserved for events threatening daily continuity, sudden illness, structural failure, or blocked passageways. Filtering out unimportant sounds conserved energy and mental resources. Work followed repetitive cycles: maintenance, repair, transport, and trade. Outcomes were measured by continuity, not improvement. Completing tasks safely outweighed speed or skill development. Stability was rewarded, novelty introduced risk. Energy allocation remained deliberate. Social hierarchy continued to guide interaction. Reputation, status, and obligation determined behavior. Misjudging authority or ignoring norms carried consequences. Reliability conferred subtle advantage. Deviation increased vulnerability. Observing and adapting to social patterns became as essential as navigating physical spaces. Health required ongoing attention. Minor ailments were normalized. Serious illness threatened survival. Remedies combined observation and practical tradition. Prevention through clothing, hygiene, diet, and rest was prioritized. Awareness of body and environment remained crucial for endurance. Children continued to learn through observation and participation. Responsibilities were assumed early. Mistakes were corrected promptly. Play was brief and integrated with work. Practical knowledge took precedence over theory. Success was measured by contribution and survival. Community remained a quiet support network. Neighbors assisted with labor, childcare, and illness. Obligations were recognized and reciprocated. Isolation increased risk. Participation provided protection. Bonds were functional and understated yet essential. Religious practice structured life. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation framed behavior. Faith explained hardship, reinforced endurance, and offered reassurance. Suffering was interpreted as meaningful, providing a psychological framework for coping. Seasonal cycles dictated activity. Winter limited labor and movement, requiring reliance on stored resources. Summer allowed greater opportunity but increased exposure. Awareness of cycles guided planning and preparation. Adaptation was constant, habitual, and unobtrusive. Life had narrowed to repetition, observation, and endurance. Comfort was minimal, hazards persistent, and persistence essential. Daily routines, careful resource management, and restraint ensured survival. Small successes, maintaining health, conserving resources, navigating streets marked continued existence. Ultimately, life in 1700s Edinburgh was steady, constrained, and unremarkable. Repetition and careful adaptation allowed persistence. Those who endured quietly day after day discovered that within narrow, limited circumstances, life, though restricted, remained possible. As time wore on, surviving in 1700s Edinburgh became an almost invisible skill. Your body and mind moved through the city with familiarity. Hazards, mud, uneven stairs, and crowded closes were anticipated without thought. Energy was preserved, attention allocated sparingly. Survival had become instinctive, guided by decades of experience rather than conscious planning. Household life demanded constant, quiet effort. Fires were tended, water hauled, floors swept, and meals prepared efficiently. Rooms remained multifunctional. Cooking, sleeping, and work occurred in shared spaces. Comfort was secondary. Functionality dominated. Repetition was the framework of survival. Deviations were risky and minimized. Food remained practical. Bread, porridge, and simple stews sustained life. Preservation dictated timing and portions. Taste was incidental. Spoiled items were discarded quickly. Planning centered on avoiding scarcity and maintaining strength. Hunger was managed systematically rather than indulged. Noise was background. Street vendors, animals, neighbors, and construction merged into a low hum. Sleep occurred in fragments but was sufficient. Attention was reserved for interruptions that threatened continuity. Illness, obstruction, or accident. Filtering unimportant disturbances conserved energy. Work cycles persisted predictably. Maintenance, repair, transport, and trade occupied daily schedules. Continuity mattered more than speed or efficiency. Avoiding mistakes outweighed ambition. Stability was rewarded. Novelty was risky. Energy allocation was deliberate and cautious. Social norms structured daily life. Hierarchy, reputation, and obligations shaped behavior. Misjudgment carried consequences. Reliability offered subtle advantage. Deviation risked disruption. Observation and adaptation were survival tools, as essential as physical navigation or resource management. Health required constant vigilance. Minor ailments and chronic discomfort were accepted. Major illness threatened stability. Remedies were practical and preventative. Hygiene, diet, clothing, and rest were central to endurance. Awareness of body and environment remained essential. Children learned through observation and participation. Responsibilities assumed early, mistakes corrected quickly. Play existed only alongside chores. Education emphasized utility over theory. Endurance and contribution defined success. Household stability depended on each member. Community persisted as quiet support. Neighbors assisted with labor, illness, and childcare. Obligations were recognized and repaid. Isolation increased risk. Participation provided security. Bonds were understated but crucial to survival. Religious practice framed daily life. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation provided structure. Faith explained hardship, reinforced endurance, and offered reassurance. Suffering gained meaning, helping residents endure without complaint. Seasonal rhythms governed activity. Winter compressed work and movement, increasing reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded labor opportunities but introduced hazards. Awareness of cycles guided planning, preparation, and adaptation. Habits became deeply ingrained. Life narrowed into repetition, observation, and endurance. Comfort was rare, danger persistent, persistence essential. Daily routines, resource management, and restraint ensured survival. Small victories, maintaining health, conserving resources, navigating streets marked ongoing existence. Ultimately, life in 1700s Edinburgh was steady, constrained, and largely unremarkable. Adaptation and endurance allowed persistence. Those who persisted quietly, day after day, discovered that within narrow, limited circumstances, life, though challenging and restricted, remained possible. By the final stage of life in 1700s Edinburgh, surviving had become second nature. The city's rhythm was fully internalized. Streets, staircases, and alleys were familiar. Hazards, mud, debris, slippery steps, crowded closes were anticipated without thought. Energy was preserved, attention reserved for deviations from expectation. Survival had become instinctive, automatic, a quiet endurance honed over decades. Household routines dominated existence. Fires were maintained, water collected and stored, floors swept, meals prepared efficiently. Rooms served multiple purposes: cooking, sleeping, working. Comfort remained secondary, function dictated behavior. Repetition and chaperonage ensured continuity. Risky deviations were minimized, habit preserving life more than desire. Food continued to be practical and repetitive. Bread, porridge, stews, and preserved meat were standard. Preservation dictated timing, portioning, and preparation. Taste was incidental. Spoiled items were discarded swiftly. Planning centered on maintaining strength, avoiding scarcity, and conserving resources. Hunger was managed methodically, noise persisted as background. Footsteps, animals, neighbors, and street activity blended into ambient hum. Sleep was fragmented but sufficient. Attention focused only on events threatening continuity: illness, obstruction, structural failure. Filtering irrelevant noise conserved energy and focus. Work cycles repeated predictably: repair, maintenance, transport, trade. Continuity mattered more than efficiency or skill improvement. Avoiding mistakes outweighed ambition. Stability was rewarded. Novelty was risky. Energy allocation remained deliberate and measured. Social hierarchy continued to govern interaction. Reputation, status, and obligations shaped behavior. Misjudgment carried consequences. Reliability conferred subtle advantage. Deviation invited hardship. Observing and adapting to social expectations became as vital as navigating the physical environment. Health remained fragile but manageable. Chronic aches and minor illnesses were normalized. Serious disease threatened stability. Remedies were limited and mostly preventive: hygiene, diet, clothing, rest. Awareness of body and environment remained essential for endurance. Children integrated naturally, assuming responsibilities early. Mistakes were corrected swiftly. Play existed only alongside chores. Practical knowledge was emphasized over theory. Contribution and endurance defined success. Household function depended on each member. Community remained a quiet network of support. Neighbors assisted with labor, childcare, and illness. Obligations were recognized and reciprocated. Isolation increased risk. Participation ensured security. Bonds were understated yet essential. Religious observance structured life. Ritual, moral guidance, and communal expectation framed behavior. Faith explained hardship, reinforced endurance, and provided reassurance. Suffering was meaningful, not preventable, and endurance was virtuous. Seasonal rhythms dictated activity. Winter compressed work and movement, increasing reliance on stored resources. Summer expanded labor but introduced exposure. Awareness of environmental cycles guided planning, preparation, and adaptation. Habits became deeply ingrained. Life had narrowed to repetition, observation, and endurance. Comfort was minimal, hazards constant, and persistence essential. Daily routines, careful management of resources, and restraint ensured survival. Small successes, maintaining health, navigating streets safely, preserving possessions marked continued existence. Ultimately, life in 1700s Edinburgh was steady, constrained, and largely unremarkable. Survival was not heroic or pleasant, but it was possible. Persistence, adaptation, and quiet endurance allowed life to continue day after day. And for those who lived this way, within narrow, limited circumstances, existence, though difficult and monotonous, remained achievable.